The time has finally arrived. I'm going to be introducing ties in today's video. I'm also going to be diving a little bit deeper into invisible bar lines. Now, we've been talking about invisible bar lines for quite some time on this channel in the past videos. But in today's video, I'm going to talk about how ties and invisible bar lines can actually work together to better compartmentalize measures and help musicians better understand rhythms, the compartmentalization of measures, and music notation in general. This is also a two-part video series, so we're going to be covering ties and invisible bar lines here in week 16 as well as week 17. If you're joining the channel for the first time, welcome to the TikATeeMethod. My name is Ron Castonguay. I'm a longtime educator, composer, author, conductor, clinician, and performer. I'm so glad you're joining me here in today's video. And we are going to get started right now. We're going to dive into ties. We're going to talk more about invisible bar lines. We're going to do some exercises together. I hope you'll stick around. Let's go do this. Here we are at week 16 and week 17's front page. Now, as you can see on this page, there's a lot to talk about. What are ties? How do they work in music notation? And how is the invisible bar line relevant in this case? So what I'd like to do is just read some of this along with you so that we can better understand what this page is all about. Before we get into the reading, it's really important for us to understand what a tie looks like in music notation. And it's right here at the top of the page. I just circled it. A tie connects two notes of the same pitch class. It is different than that of the articulation marking of a slur. And I have a section in my book that talks about the difference between a tie and a slur. The way that I like to think about ties is they're simply musical addition symbols. They connect two notes and they add their values together. So let's get into the reading a little bit and talk about that. Ties act like musical addition symbols. And when two notes are tied together, they combine their values. For example, if a quarter note and a half note are tied together, the resulting value of the rhythm would be a note that is held for 3 full beats. A quarter note gets 1 beat, a half note gets 2 beats. When you add those together, it equals 3. It would look like this in music notation: a quarter note and a half note, and here's my tie. That would equal 3 beats. Now, that's the same as a dotted half note, which also gets 3 beats. So why would we use a quarter note tied to a half note instead of a dotted half note? Well, that's some of the topic that we're going to be talking about today and how invisible bar lines and ties work together to compartmentalize measures. There's a time to use a quarter note tied to a half note, and there's a time to use a dotted half note. And we'll talk about that as we go through this chapter. The next paragraph basically reviews invisible bar lines, which we've been using, as I said, in the past videos. Let's read. Compartmentalization, as mentioned previously, allows the musician to better interpret a measure and visualize its divisions. Imagine a measure in common time divided into 2 equal parts. Now imagine drawing a vertical dashed line in between the 2 halves, between beats 2 and 3 in this case. See the image above. This is called the invisible bar line. So if we look at this image above, let me erase this circle here, we can see that the invisible bar line splits the measure directly in half with this dotted line. So we can see beats 1 and 2 here, the invisible bar line, and then beats 3 and 4. Now, we've been doing this in the past videos, so you should be pretty good at it by now. But we're going to talk about how invisible bar lines and ties work together. Let's go on. The invisible bar line plays a significant role not only in how musicians view a symmetrical measure, one that can be divided into 2 equal halves, but also in the way we choose to notate rhythms. As a general rule, it is best not to break the invisible bar line. This means, in common time, for example, a note or rest cannot be placed directly in the middle of beats 2 and 3. Instead, we use ties. Ties can often help bridge the 2 halves of a measure, thereby accommodating the general invisible bar line rule. There are 2 primary reasons to use a tie in music notation. Number one, as a musical addition symbol, to increase the total duration or value of the tied notes, to sustain that note duration. Or number two, as I just mentioned, a musical bridge, to avoid breaking any invisible bar line or to bridge over a solid bar line connecting the measures. Below are two excerpts of rhythmically identical music. The first example is an excerpt that breaks the invisible bar line rule in all 8 measures. You will see the vertical dashed line is going through a note head in each measure. The second excerpt repairs all of the rule breaks by utilizing ties. Now, a little caveat here. Will publishers sometimes break the invisible bar line? Absolutely. But in the beginning stages of understanding rhythm and reading music notation, I find it to be really important for students to have that compartmentalization and to adhere to the invisible bar line rule. It just helps us better understand rhythmic sight words in this case. And if we're going to learn music or rhythms as a language, it's important for us to be able to compartmentalize them and for measures not to become confusing in any way, shape, or form. When we break the invisible bar line, oftentimes it can create confusion, especially for beginning musicians. But again, going back to my original caveat, will publishers break the invisible bar line? Yes, absolutely they will, and you see it all the time. I'm just suggesting that we don't in this case as we're learning rhythms. This highlighted statement right here is going to become very important as we get into the exercises. When ties are used to bridge a bar line, the verbiage changes. For example, if an eighth note is tied to a whole note, then the word T would be held for the full duration. So for example, if I did have an eighth note tied to a whole note, this would actually be T held out for the full value of those two notes combined. So the first note in the tie becomes the one that dictates what the verbiage will be in the Tik-A-Tee method. It just helps keep things consistent. And we'll go over this more as we go throughout the chapter and start practicing the exercises. Let's now turn our attention to these two excerpts and how they differ and how ties and invisible bar lines make one easier to read than the other. Keep in mind that these excerpts are rhythmically identical. One is just observing the invisible bar line rule and utilizing ties, and the other one is breaking the invisible bar line rule. And I want to start off by saying, in the one that has the X next to it, this one right here, this is pretty subjective, but this is, in my opinion, what we should be doing at this stage in our rhythmic journey and reading music notation. I think we should be observing the invisible bar line as much as we possibly can. That being said, in the first excerpt, there are 3 or 4 measures in there that I could imagine publishers actually publishing the music this way and breaking the invisible bar line. What I want to do is go one measure at a time, comparing the top excerpt to the bottom excerpt and how they're written differently and how you can start to compartmentalize these measures. So let's look at measure 1 in both of these excerpts. In measure 1 in the top excerpt, we have beats 1, 2, and 3 on this half note, and beat 4 is that quarter note. It would sound like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ta, ta. Now that's a pretty straightforward measure, and this is one of the measures that I think a publisher may actually publish this way. But let's take a look at the first measure in the second excerpt here, and notice how beats 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are separated by this invisible bar line. In my opinion, this accommodates not only the invisible bar line rule, but helps beginning musicians better compartmentalize the measure, where they can see that there is a quarter note, then there is a tied quarter note bridging the gap between beats 2 and 3, and then a quarter note on beat 4. The rhythm is identical. Ta, ta, ta. But in this case, we don't have a note smack dab in the middle between beats 2 and 3, breaking that invisible bar line. But like I said, this is subjective. I believe that in this stage of our rhythmic journey, the one on the bottom is the way I would prefer to teach it to students, but you will see publishers publish it like the one above. It's good to know that both of them are the same, and it's also good to know how we can use ties to bridge the gap between the invisible bar line and connect those two halves of a 4/4 measure. In the second measure, even more so than in the first measure, I can totally see a publisher publishing the music like this because it's a very straightforward rhythm and it's very easy to wrap your head around, even if you're a beginning musician. We know that a dotted half note gets 3 beats. We know that a quarter note gets 1 beat. The dotted half note comes in on beat 1, the quarter note comes in on beat 4. Very easy for us to see and to sight read. It'll sound like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ta. So then why did I mark it in the X excerpt, the one that's wrong, quote unquote? And again, this is very subjective. It's because I want us to understand the compartmentalization of a 4/4 measure being divided into 2 equal halves. So let's look what I've done in the second measure of the second excerpt. I've taken a half note here, which takes up beats 1 and 2, and I've tied it to a quarter note so that we can accommodate this invisible bar line. A tie can go over an invisible bar line and bridge that gap. And remember now, a dotted half note gets 3 beats, but so does a half note tied to a quarter note. Then we have this last quarter note entering on beat 4. The rhythm is identical. Ta, ta. The only difference is, in the second excerpt, I'm not breaking that invisible bar line rule. Again, the caveat. Yes, this is subjective. Yes, publishers will publish it both ways. And in this case, in measure 2, both ways are actually correct. In measure 3, contrary to measures 1 and 2, this one is definitely written incorrectly, in my opinion, and I would hope that publishers wouldn't publish a measure like this. It really breaks the invisible bar line and makes it confusing for musicians, beginning or advanced, to sight read this measure quickly or efficiently. Let me show you what I mean. We have a quarter note on beat 1, which is pretty straightforward. However, coming in on beat 2 and going through beat 3, we have the 2-beat rhythmic sight word from week 10. Ti, ta, ti. So we have some 8th note syncopation, and we're breaking the invisible bar line here. Then we've got a quarter note on beat 4. There is definitely a better way to write this measure. Let's look at the third measure in the second excerpt. I have a quarter note on beat 1, I have 2 8th notes coming in on beat 2, and I'm tying the second 8th note of that grouping to the first 8th note on beat 3. And by doing that, I'm observing this invisible bar line and bridging the gap with a tie. Then I have this 8th note coming in on the upbeat of beat 3, and then this quarter note coming in on the downbeat of beat 4. If I was to say the verbiage for the second excerpt, measure 3, it sounds like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, 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 ta. I'll do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, 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 ta. I would much rather see measure 3 in the second excerpt because I can more easily distinguish beats 1 and 2, the invisible bar line, and then beats 3 and 4. Being able to compartmentalize the measures like that when I sight read and thinking about rhythms as sight words and music as a language just makes so much more sense to me. Let's move on to measure 4, which is another measure that I would hope publishers would never publish this way. Putting a dotted quarter note on the second beat in a 4/4 measure is a big no-no, in my opinion. We want to observe the invisible bar line and allow musicians to compartmentalize a 4/4 measure. I'm not even going to look at the top excerpt. Let's look at the second excerpt, measure 4, and how this rhythm should be notated. We have a quarter rest on beat 1. On beat 2, we've got a quarter note with this tie bridging the gap over the invisible bar line. It's tied to an 8th note. A quarter note plus an 8th note is equivalent to a dotted quarter note, and we'll just say ta for the duration. Then on the upbeat of beat 3, we have this T 8th note, and on the downbeat of beat 4, we have this quarter note. So measure 4 will sound like this in the second excerpt. 1, 2, 3, 4, rest. Ta, ti, ta. I'll do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4, rest. Ta, ti, ta. That's the way that that measure should be notated. And again, I hope publishers would never notate a dotted quarter note coming in on beat 2 in a 4/4 measure. I hope that makes sense to you. Measure 5 is one of the measures that can be published either way. It's a pretty easy rhythm to wrap our heads around, again, even for beginning musicians. We have 2/8 notes coming in on beat 1, and then we have a dotted half note coming in on beat 2 and lasting for 3 beats. It would sound like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. Ti-ti-ta. And I held that out full value. So you could actually see it published as it is in the top excerpt right here. The reason that I'm saying that it's wrong and I have it in the big red X excerpt is because it's just breaking the invisible bar line. Let's look at the 5th measure in the 2nd excerpt. What I've done here is I've taken 2/8 notes that come in on beat 1, which is the same thing. I've got a quarter note now coming in on beat 2, and I'm bridging the gap between beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4 by using a tie over the invisible bar line right here. And I'm tying that quarter note to a half note. A dotted half note gets 3 beats. Well, that is equivalent to a quarter note tied to a half note. So the verbiage and the rhythm in the 5th measure of the 2nd excerpt is identical to the rhythm in the 1st excerpt. 1, 2, here it is. Ti-ti-ta. So it can be written both ways. Again, just the little caveat. Could it be published as it is in the 1st excerpt by a publisher? Absolutely. You will see this one written both ways because it's pretty easy to understand right away. Now, measure 6 is a very interesting measure because it can be notated in 3 different ways. And to be honest, I've seen publishers notate the rhythms in measure 6 all 3 ways. So it depends on the publisher and the piece of music that you're reading. Now, you know me. Do I have a preference? Of course I do, and I'll talk about that in a second. The one I least prefer is the one in the top excerpt. Now, let me say this for you first so that you can hear the cool 8th note syncopation that is formed from this rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ti-ta-ta-ta-ti. Now, if I'm saying it and you're hearing it and you just repeat it after me, great, you'd probably catch on very, very quickly. But if you're a beginning musician and you're looking at the 6th measure in the top excerpt, that is going to be a confusing measure for you to see. And it's because we're breaking that invisible bar line. So if I look at the 6th measure in the 2nd excerpt, what I did was I've taken an entire measure and filled it with 8th notes. Then I've tied the 2nd 8th note in each pairing to the next 8th note. The verbiage changes, but now I can easily distinguish beats 1 and 2, the invisible bar line, and beats 3 and 4. Here's what it sounds like in the 2nd excerpt, 6th measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. T, 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 T. And since they're all T's, you can really wrap your head around the fact that it's 8th note syncopation. T, 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 T. Okay, so that's the 2nd way you can write this rhythm. Now, my preferred way is actually the one right down here at the bottom. It's taking weak 10's rhythm. So if you look at beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4, I have weak 10's rhythm here, that 2-beat rhythmic sight word. And what I'm doing is I'm tying that last 8th note of the 1st pattern to the first 8th note of the 2nd pattern, bridging the gap between beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4 by using a tie. Here's what it sounds like in the 3rd way we can notate this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ti, ta, ti, ta, ti. I'll do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ti, ta, ti, ta, ti. The reason that I prefer this one most is because I can see that weak 10 rhythmic sight word 2 times in that measure, and the tie is helping me see that invisible bar line even better. Being able to distinguish beats 1 and 2 from beats 3 and 4 just makes the most sense for me and definitely for beginning musicians. Now, going back to my original caveat, could you see this rhythm published either way? 1, 2, or 3? Absolutely. I'm just telling you that I would prefer the 3rd one, or maybe a second choice would be the 2nd one for beginning musicians to really begin to see the 8th note syncopation that is created from the rhythms in measure 6. So I hope that makes sense to you. Let's move on to measure 7. Now, measure 7 is another one of these measures that I hope a publisher would never publish a piece of music with this rhythm in it. Imagine a 4/4 measure and you have a dotted quarter note entering on the upbeat of beat 2. That's what's happening in measure 7. Now, there's a lot of ink on this page, so let me first clear some of this ink here so we can start fresh. I'll even use a red pen here to talk about measure 7. So I'm going to look at measure 7 in the top excerpt here. Let's look through it. So we have beat 1, these 2 eighth notes, very straightforward, no problem. Here on beat 2, we have an eighth note and then a dotted quarter note entering on the upbeat of beat 2. And again, that's very confusing. It's really breaking the invisible bar line, not allowing musicians to easily distinguish beats 1 and 2 from beats 3 and 4. And our brain wants to do that. Now, I can see that there's 2 eighth notes right here at the very end of the measure. And yes, I know that they're going to enter on beat 4. But again, I've been doing music a long time. And we're talking about musicians that are beginners, intermediate, or even a little bit better than intermediate. This is still a confusing measure. So the way that this should be written, I want you to look at measure 7 in the bottom excerpt here. What I've done here is I've got 2 eighth notes on beat 1. That doesn't need to change. That's easy. Then I have 2 eighth notes on beat 2, and the second eighth note is tied to a quarter note on beat 3 here. Now, a dotted quarter note is equivalent to an eighth note tied to a quarter note, 1.5 beats. But now I have an invisible bar line, and I'm using a tie to bridge that gap. And then I can see easily now that my 2 eighth notes that finish off that measure come in on 4 and the upbeat of beat 4. The idea of compartmentalizing this measure to make it more digestible for musicians is the whole point to having ties and invisible bar lines working together to make music easier to understand for musicians. And again, I don't care if you're a beginner, an intermediate, an advanced, a professional musician. I would prefer the second rhythm in the second excerpt way over that first one. And that's why I hope publishers would understand that as well. All right, I'm done with my rant. However, I'm not done analyzing rhythms that should never be published the way they're notated. Check out measure 8 in the top excerpt. You can see right away that we've got a note smack dab right on the invisible bar line, and we also have a beam crossing over the invisible bar line. So 2 things are happening in this measure that I really disagree with and should never be notated this way. If we were to try to analyze this rhythm in measure 8 in the top excerpt, I think we'd get stuck. Let's find out. Here we have beat 1, quarter note, great, no problem. Beat 2, we've got an eighth note coming in. All right. So far, so good. We've got this 16th note coming in on the upbeat of beat 2. Now, here's where we run into trouble. We've got this eighth note smack dab on the invisible bar line. And where, mathematically, does that eighth note enter? It enters on the last 16th note of the second beat. Well, could you imagine trying to figure that out in real time as you're sight reading? No, it's crazy. This measure has 16th note syncopation in it, and it's written in a very confusing way. Let's move to the 8th measure of the second excerpt now and see how this can be better notated and incorporates a little bit of 16th note syncopation. So here we go. On beat 1, we have that quarter note, which is very, very straightforward, right? No problems there. On beat 2, we have weak 7's rhythmic motif. T, Tik-A, T, Tik-A, T, Tik-A, T, Tik-A. Pretty straightforward. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking that last 16th note, however, and I'm tying it to that third beat. I'm bridging the gap and observing that invisible bar line. And on beat 3 is also weak 7's rhythm, Tik-A-T, 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 Tik-A-T. The only difference is I won't be saying tick because of the previous tie, and I'll demonstrate what that sounds like in a moment. So we have a little bit of 16th note syncopation right here with that 16th note. The upbeat of beat 3 is that 8th note, and then on the downbeat of beat 4 is that quarter note. So this allows us to compartmentalize this measure. We observe the invisible bar line by utilizing a tie to bridge that gap. We can easily distinguish beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4. Let me demonstrate what this sounds like using the Tik-A-Tee verbiage. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, tika, a ti, ta. Let me do that again for you. You can do it along with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, tika, a ti, ta. That's a really fun rhythm. There's some 8th note syncopation. There's a little bit of 16th note syncopation right after that third beat. It's a fun rhythm, but it's pretty challenging. And if you notate it in an even more challenging way, then it's going to be very difficult for beginning musicians to understand how to read these rhythms, and they're going to get confused with music notation. Now, I know somebody in the comments or somebody out there is going to say, actually, I can read measure 8 in that top excerpt without a problem. Good for you. I'm very happy for you. I could too, but it's not the way it should be written. We need to be observing the invisible bar line in a 4/4 measure to make reading music easier for people. Not just beginning musicians, but also for professional musicians. So I'm going to move on. We've now gone through all of this explanation and these diagrams and these 2 excerpts and these definitions. We have to actually put some of this to practice ourselves. We need to go find some exercises to work on our ties and finding invisible bar lines a little bit more. Let's go do that right now. We're going to start off with a nice easy exercise here, exercise 16A. Now it says in the directions, can you find the invisible bar line in each of these exercises? It's referring to all the exercises in week 16 and in week 17, and there are a bunch of them. Now we've already been doing this in the past videos here, so we should be able to find the invisible bar lines in these exercises pretty easily. Let's analyze 16A. In measure 1, we've got a quarter note. Then we've got another quarter note here on beat 2. We can draw in our invisible bar line, and that tie right there bridges beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4 and combines those 2 quarter notes. So we're going to hold out that like it's a half note. Then we have beat 4 over here. Now beat 3, I'll put here, but I'll put a parenthesis around it because we're not going to re-articulate that quarter note. Ta, ta, ta. Because of that tie in the middle there, that middle note will get 2 beats and we don't re-articulate beat 3. Moving on to measure 2, we've got a half note on beat 1 and 2 tied to a quarter note on beat 3. So that's like a dotted half note. So I would write -4 here over that quarter rest. In the third measure, we have beat 1 right here, beat 2 right here, beat 3 right here, and beat 4 on this quarter note. Now let's talk about these ties and that invisible bar line. We have a tie going from the second 8th note to the first 8th note on beat 2, and we have a tie going from the upbeat of beat 2 to the downbeat of beat 3. So that's going to be like a dotted quarter note, 1.5 beats. Where is our invisible bar line here? Well, it's going to squeeze right here underneath this tie. That tie is going to bridge the gap between beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4. So that measure, T, 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 ta, a really, really cool measure with some nice 8th note syncopation. Moving on to measure 4, we've got week 6's rhythm right here, that dotted quarter note to the flagged 8th note. That's going to take up beats 1 and 2. Our invisible bar line is going to go right here before the half note, which is on beats 3 and 4. And while we're saying that half note, we do want to be looking ahead at what's coming up on the next line in measure 5. And in measure 5, we've got a half note here on beats 1 and 2, then an invisible bar line. Then we've got a quarter note coming in on beat 3, and that's tied to an 8th note that enters on beat 4. I'll put parentheses there because we're not going to re-articulate that 8th note. Then this last 8th note on the upbeat of 4, we will articulate with a T. Now, beats 3 and 4 could be re-notated as a dotted quarter note to a flagged 8th note. The only reason I didn't notate it that way here in this exercise is because we want to practice ties, but they're the same exact rhythm. Now, let's talk about the verbiage for a second. When you've got a quarter note tied to an 8th note, the quarter note is ta, the 8th note is normally T, but since it's tied, that first note of the tie will always dictate what the verbiage is going to be. And in this case, we're just going to hold ta for 1.5 beats. So a dotted quarter note to an 8th note would be the same exact verbiage as a quarter note tied to an 8th note with another 8th note on that upbeat. They would sound the same, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, T, ta, T. And if that sounds familiar, that's the rhythm from week 6. Okay, let's move on. Here's something really important that musicians need to notice. Do you see a difference between measure 5 and measure 6? If you don't, you're absolutely right. It's an identical measure. It is a repeat of measure 5. And as musicians, beginning, intermediate, or advanced, it helps us sight read so much better when we can see these things, when we notice these things. Measure 6 is the same exact rhythm as measure 5. So I'm going to move on to measure 7. Okay, where we have a dotted quarter note to eighth note rhythm. That's our rhythm from week 6 that we just talked about. That's going to take up beats 1 and 2. Then on beats 3 and 4, we've got a reverse dotted rhythm from week 12, the eighth note to the dotted quarter note. It's just taking our week 6 rhythm and turning it around, and that's beats 3 and 4. This measure now has a tie in the center, however, and we're taking these two eighth notes and combining them together, bridging beats 3 and 4 with beats 1 and 2, and observing that invisible bar line, which is really fun. So measure 7 will sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, ta. I'll do that again. Do it with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, ta. That's a really cool measure, and it's written correctly, and that is definitely the way that I would want that to be written. Going on to the final measure, measure 8 here in the second line, we've got a half note on beats 1 and 2. That's tied to an eighth note, which comes in on beat 3, and I'll put a parenthesis there because we're not going to re-articulate it. We're adding that eighth note to the half note. A tie is like a musical addition symbol. Then we do say this T on the upbeat of beat 3, and then this quarter note on beat 4. So that last measure is going to sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, ta. Another fun measure, another way that we can add ties, which is really cool. Where is the invisible bar line in this last measure? The invisible bar line is right here inside this tie. That tie accommodates the invisible bar line and bridges the gap between beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4. All right, we've analyzed this exercise. It should be pretty straightforward. If you need to go through it any further and analyze it at your own pace, feel free to press pause on the video now and just come back and join me to perform this. But I'm going to go perform this right now. All right, the first thing I'm going to do, as in the past, I'm going to clear this ink for you so you can see the exercise a little more clearly. I'm sticking with my old faithful Boss DB90 metronome. We're going to stay at 74 beats per minute, or the quarter note equals 74. I'll be vocalizing this exercise on a G3. You're welcome to do that with me, or an octave lower, an octave higher, or a different note altogether. But the whole point of this is that you vocalize the rhythm for exercise 16A with me. All right, let's get the metronome started. I'm going to turn up the volume here on the metronome. All right, there we go. And here is your G3. And I'm going to count it off, and I hope you'll join me. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and ta, 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 ta. Ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, ta, 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 ti, ta, ta, ti, ta, ti, ta, ta, ti, ta. Okay. Stop that metronome, turn down the volume here. Now you'll notice I held notes out full value, but you also probably noticed that there's only one rest in this whole exercise. So I had to breathe wherever I needed to breathe, but maintaining the integrity of the rhythms. Okay, so we performed it. We vocalized it with a metronome, but now we need to know if we did it correctly. We've got to go check it against the MP3 for exercise 16A. So let's go do that right now. Okay, here we are at my website where you can find all 363 of the MP3s that accompany my book. We are going to listen to 16A, and just to recap, what are our 3 options here? Well, option number 1 is to just listen to the exercise and check for our accuracy that way. Option 2 is to actually vocalize along with the MP3. And option number 3, if your instrument isn't primarily the voice, you've got to break out your instrument and perform it along with the exercise. That's a great way to practice these rhythms, and it is the final step before you can proceed anyway. Okay, so without further ado, let's press play on exercise 16A. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Ta 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 ta. Ti 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 ta ta ti ta. Ta ta ti ta. Ta ti ta ti ta. Ta ti ta.
And there you have it, exercise 16A with the MP3. So if you didn't choose option 3 just now and performing it on your instrument, that is the next crucial step before we move on to the next exercise. So please go ahead and do that right now before moving on.
Hey, Ron. All right. 1, 2.
And on to the next exercise, which in this case is the very next exercise, 16B. Let's analyze. In measure 1, we've got a half note tied to a quarter note. That's just like a dotted half note. A half note is 2 beats, a quarter note is 1 beat, a tie is a musical addition symbol, therefore it gets 3 full beats. I would write -4 over this quarter rest. In measure 2, something really cool is happening. We have 2 consecutive ties. It's like having 2 musical addition symbols. So we're going to have 3 notes that are combined in a value, which is really fun. So we have a half note here on beats 1 and 2. We've got a quarter note here on beat 3 and an eighth note here on beat 4. I would parenthesize beats 3 and 4 here just to remind myself that I'm not going to be re-articulating those. However, this last eighth note on the upbeat of 4, I will say T. In measure 3, we've got weak 6's rhythm, which is that dotted quarter note to the eighth note, and then we've got an invisible bar line right here. Beat 3 is this eighth rest with this flagged eighth note on the upbeat of 3. Beat 4 is this eighth rest with these 2 16th notes coming in on the upbeat of 4. This rhythm was actually introduced in last week's video, week 15. Going back to measures 1 and 2, let's go back and put some invisible bar lines in. The invisible bar line in measure 1 is going to go right after this half note. And the invisible bar line in measure 2 is going to go right after this half note. So it's in between beats 2 and 3. Going on to measure 4, the last measure in the first line, we've got these 2 eighth notes coming in on beat 1. So we've got an upbeat here, but it's tied to a quarter note. An eighth note tied to a quarter note. T is going to dictate the verbiage. So we're actually going to hold T for an entire beat and a half there. Okay, beat 2 is here, but I'm going to put a parenthesis on it because we're not going to re-articulate that quarter note. The invisible bar line will go right here, and beats 3 and 4 are pretty straightforward. These 2 quarter notes, they're so straightforward that I'm hoping we can look ahead to the next line to see what's coming up next. And what's coming up next in measure 5 is a quarter note. Then we've got an eighth note here on beat 2. We've got this eighth note coming in on the upbeat of beat 2, but it's tied to the downbeat of beat 3. So I'm going to put a parenthesis around beat 3 because we're not going to re-articulate that. We are, however, going to re-articulate the upbeat of beat 3 with that T eighth note. Then we've got a quarter note on beat 4. So measure 5 will sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ti, 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 ta. A really fun measure with some eighth note syncopation. Measure 6, we've got a half note here on beats 1 and 2, tied to a quarter note. Our invisible bar line will go right here after that half note. The invisible bar line bridges the gap between beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4. A half note plus a quarter note is just like a dotted half note, so it gets 3 beats. On the last beat here, beat 4, we've got an 8th note coming in on beat 4, then we have an upbeat 8th note here, but this one is tied over a solid bar line into the next measure. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to put a beat 1 here with a parenthesis around it because we're not going to rearticulate that. We will, however, rearticulate that T on the and of or the upbeat of beat 1. This quarter note is beat 2, invisible bar line. Then beats 3 and 4 are tied over the bar line again to beats 1 and 2 in the next measure. So we're going to have a half note plus a half note, 4 beats, but it's over a bar line. This last quarter note comes in on beat 3, and let's hold it full value all the way to this quarter rest on beat 4. I would write -4. Now, we need to add a couple of invisible bar lines here. The last measure, the invisible bar line is going to go right here. In measure 5, it's going to go right where that tie is. That tie bridges the gap between beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4, which is really kind of cool. All right, we've analyzed exercise 16B. I guess now it's time. Let's throw a metronome on. Let's go vocalize it. First things first, let's clear this ink so it's not any more confusing than it needs to be. All right, I'm going to get the metronome started. I'm going to give you a pitch. Let's vocalize this exercise together. There's our metronome. I'm going to turn it up a little bit here. Here's our pitch. And here we go. Hope you'll join me. 1, 2, ready, and ta, ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, Tik-A-tee-tee, ta, 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 ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ta. Okay. I had to sneak a couple breaths in there, as you heard. There were some rests, but towards the end on that second line, I had to sneak some breaths in while trying my best to maintain the integrity of the rhythms. Okay, we performed. We vocalized 16B with a metronome. You know what the next step is. Let's go find the MP3 for 16B. And here we are, back at my website where you can find all the MP3s. We are going to press play on exercise 16B. You first need to decide which of the 3 options you're going to choose. Just listening, vocalizing along with the MP3, or playing your instrument along with the MP3. Get ready, get set, here we go. One, 2, 3, 4.
Ta, ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, Tik-A-tee-tee, ta, 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 ti, 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 ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ta, ta.
All right, exercise 16B. So if you didn't play it yet on your instrument, you know that you need to do that before moving on.
All right, here we go. 16B. One, two. One, ready.
And there you have it, the introduction of ties, the musical addition symbol. We also dove a little deeper into invisible bar lines, and we talked about how ties can actually help us accommodate invisible bar lines, which in turn help us compartmentalize 4/4 measures so we can distinguish between beats 1 and 2 and beats 3 and 4 a little bit better. We also talked a little bit about renotating rhythms. Some really cool stuff here in week 16. Well, in week 17, we're just going to do a little bit more with ties and with invisible bar lines. So I hope you'll join me. I'm looking forward to that video. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I hope that you will. It'll help out the YouTube algorithm, and be sure that these videos can reach a wider audience and more people can learn about rhythmic sight reading. And if you haven't checked out my book, keep in mind these videos are intended to be just resources to all of the material that are in my books, including 346 practice exercises. All the details are in the description below, so go check it out. Thanks so much for joining me in today's video. I can't wait for week 17. I hope you don't get tied up and that you can join us. We'll see you next time.